So what is Brainwarp? Pimax says it's a unique set of VR features implemented into the Pimax VR headset software, including the rendering pipeline that provides solutions for significant increase in performance, resulting in a smoother VR experience using the Pimax VR headsets. One of the main features of Brainwarp, called Smart Smoothing, should theoretically provide you with a smooth VR experience despite a low frame rate render. As VR flight and racing simulators are by far the most GPU and CPU demanding VR experiences, I will start this Brainwarp series part 1 by testing 10 of the most popular VR simulators available today. Exactly how does the motion smoothing work in this simulator, you may ask, and does it really make all these VR simulators fully playable and smooth on a Pimax VR headset? Well, let's find out. Before we jump in, a big thanks to all my lovely Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. One of the Brainwarp features is Smart Smoothing, a technique that limits the frame rate to render at 50% of the original full frame rate, and by doing some magic interpolation tricks, Smart Smoothing doubles the frame rate again before it gets sent to the headset. Now the interpolated image with full frame rate finally renders in the VR headset, making the perceived VR experience silky smooth, as if it actually was running in a full frame rate like 90 Hz or 90 frames per second on a Pimax 5K Plus or 80 frames per second on a Pimax 8K. Okay, don't worry, I won't geek out about Brainwarp here today. In fact, I don't even understand how this motion smoothing is working on a technical level, and I'm sure it's not that important for you to know either, as long as it works, right? Playing any VR game or experience regardless of headset used, as soon as you get frame drops, the image will start to judder or stutter. Not your head movements really, but the surroundings in VR will not have a fully smooth move or panning while walking, running, driving a car or flying an aircraft. Playing a car racing simulator in 60, 85 or even 89 frames per second on a VR headset with 90 Hz refresh rate is not the most pleasant experience. It will cause judder and stutter. The majority of people will notice this, or at least their brain will, and this could lead to motion sickness, nausea or even headache after longer sessions. Now here's why Smart Smoothing even exists. It only requires half of the needed frame rate to be processed and rendered by your GPU and CPU. Once you cannot reach the full frame rate, the game will start to run in, let's say, 40 or 45 frames per second, but in the VR headset it will still look and feel like 80 or 90 frames per second, in other words the double or the full frame rate. If your graphic card can only render a VR game or simulator in, let's say, 60 or 70 frames per second on a Pimax 8K with 80 Hz displays, it's actually better to let the Smart Smoothing kick in and do the job, because it will ask the GPU to render only 40 frames per second instead, and let the algorithm interpolate every second frame and then transform the frame rate to 80 frames per second inside of the headset. With Smart Smoothing, your image will look much smoother, more or less identical to real 80 frames per second on a Pimax 8K, but that also means we need to maintain a stable 40 frames per second frame rate and not less, in this case using a Pimax 8K. If the frame rate goes below 40 frames per second, then Smart Smoothing can't help anymore and you will see judders and stutters again. But hey, it's much easier for the GPU to render 40 frames per second rather than 80, right? Anyway, for this video I made all the testings and recordings using a Pimax 8K headset which runs in a maximum refresh rate of 80 Hz. In other words, it can only render a maximum of 80 frames per second. If you divide those 80 frames per second by 2, you will get 40 frames per second, right? Now that's the magic number we want to maintain at all time, of course. For all the tests I'm using the latest Python version 129, and I'm also using default Python render quality at 1.0, including a normal field of view only, which is around 150 degrees horizontally. The SteamVR super sampling is kept at 100% at all time, and individual in-game settings will be presented during each test. As for the hardware, I'm using my overclocked RTX 2080 Ti, an Intel i9 9900K processor and 32GB of RAM memory. Now let's get started by trying out Project Cars 2, one of the most demanding VR racing simulators available that also requires parallel projection being enabled, which by the way results in a slightly higher rendered resolution in the Pimax headsets. I'm running a vanilla version of Project Cars 2 without any modification or custom INI files. You can see my in-game settings here, which includes in-game super sampling of 1.4, making the image look much sharper. Using these settings on my PC without smart smoothing enabled gives me a jumping frame rate of between 50 and 65 frames per second, which is far from a smooth experience. Now with the smart smoothing enabled, I'm happy to report it's a night and day difference. I get a fully smooth movement of my surroundings, the image feels like it's actually running in full 80 frames per second, and I immediately get the proper sense of speed without any lag. I get no judder and stutters whatsoever as long as the frame rate is stable 40 frames per second, which it is during my whole session actually. The opponent car movements are also very smooth, even if I can occasionally see some slight artifacts in the form of minor ghosting around the edges of the cars, and also especially in very fast movements and speed. There is no ghosting of the surroundings around the track at all, but the steering wheel movements in front of me feels a little bit reprojected and not 100% smooth. All in all, I think this is great news for all the Project Cars 2 fans. With a proper GPU, it's now possible to run this car simulator with a very smooth frame rate overall and a perfect sense of speed without any lag or any minor ghosting issues. Now let's have a look at X-Plane 11 in VR, which is probably the most CPU heavy VR simulator because of its old engine using only one core or one thread for the graphic rendering. As always when flying in X-Plane 11, I'm using some tweaks including the Fly with Lua script to maintain a better frame rate. I'm also using medium to high settings in-game and anti-aliasing at 2.0, and with these settings I'm hitting a frame rate of around 40 to 50 frames per second without motion smoothing being active. Well, it's quite okay, it's playable, but it's far from smooth. Enabling smart smoothing was a shock to me here. Never before have I been able to get a smooth flight in X-Plane 11 on a Pimax headset with normal field of view, but now it just runs butter smooth, at least when it comes to the movement of the surroundings outside of the airplane. Although my VR hands get a slight ghosting effect, which on the other hand is not a huge problem, especially if you use a yoke or a joystick instead. Anyway, most of the time judders and stutters are basically non-existent except for a few short scenarios when the frame rate goes slightly below 40 frames per second flying around a custom high-resolution scenery pack of the San Francisco. But I wouldn't call this distracting. The landing on San Francisco International was super smooth and the smart smoothing is a game changer here. But there are a few downsides, yes. There is a slight amount of ghosting on some of the buildings you fly by, and the area within the front propeller of the Cessna has some sort of artifacts such as ghosting and deformation. I can't really explain what it is, but it just looks weird. I would say if it's possible to modify the Cessna model and remove the visible propeller rotation, I would recommend you to do so to solve this problem. Anyhow, besides the downsides, X-Plane 11 VR is now a blast using the Pimax headsets, at least if you can maintain a 40 frames per second frame rate using the Pimax 8K headset or 45 frames per second using a Pimax 5K Plus, which might require some lower in-game settings or simply by disabling the anti-aliasing, for example. Next up, R Factor 2. When using almost maximum in-game graphical settings including anti-aliasing of level 3 and FXAA on, the simulator runs in between 55 to 65 frames per second on my system with a Pimax. To get a stable 80 frames per second frame rate, I would need to not only lower lots of the visual quality settings and turn off the anti-aliasing, but also most likely turn down the super sampling or even the field of view to small. Again, with smart smoothing smoothing enabled, this car racing simulator gets super smooth. I really mean it, it looks totally smooth, and I'm actually a bit surprised how well the R-Factor 2 racing simulator runs in 40 frames per second only, with all these options enabled and with smart smoothing. I see basically no ghosting on opponent cars while driving, and the sense of speed gets a nice boost as well compared how it looked and felt without the smart smoothing enabled when I was running this simulator in 60 frames per second. The frame rate has no spikes below 40 frames per second at all on my system, and because I'm maintaining the graphical fidelity almost at max, including a high resolution, R-Factor 2 also looks pretty impressive and surprisingly realistic, even if I'm running this without my racing wheel setup and only using a gamepad for this testing session. Now let's see how the simulator Elite Dangerous can handle the smart smoothing. Elite Dangerous could of course be run in around 80 up to 90 frames per second on my system if the settings are lowered down a bit, including the in-game super sampling and some additional tweaks. But using the in-game preset VR High with super sampling at 1.0 and HMD image quality super sampling at 1.25, it gets quite heavy for the GPU even on my overclocked RTX 2080 Ti. The frame rate is around 50 to 60 frames per second, and it can go as low as 40 in intense action. Turning on the smart smoothing made Elite Dangerous instantly super smooth. Rolling the spaceship and flying around even in combat is a silky smooth experience now, and as far as I can tell from my testing session, there is no visible artifacts such as ghosting visible, as long as the frame rate stays at 40 frames per second and does not go below 40. I know there might be some more intense scenarios in this simulator, especially during online gameplay with many opponents, but I'm sure I would be able to keep a stable 40 frames per second on my system, at least if I decrease some of the graphical effects or lower the HMD quality super sampling value to default 1.0. Anyhow, Elite Dangerous is a space simulator that simply requires a fully smooth gameplay, and from my testing results, it's now fully possible using smart smoothing on the Pimax 8K. Another racing simulator coming up is Assetto Corsa Competizione, or Assetto Corsa 2 as some people call it. Do you remember me playing this simulator a while ago on the Pimax? It was hardly possible unless I turned down the settings almost to minimal values. Even though some things has been improved since then, unfortunately this title isn't optimized for VR yet. And running it without the built-in temporal anti-aliasing make it looks extremely shimmery, full of aliasing no matter what resolution you use. Now for this test I basically maxed out the settings except for the shadow quality and the mirror quality, which I set to medium. I enabled the temporal anti-aliasing and put it on high. With smart smoothing running the France circuit, this simulator looks great indeed, but the frame rate could barely hit 50 frames per second and stayed most of the time around 45, which made it quite a frustrating experience with lots of judders and no sense of speed at all. Enabling the smart smoothing locked the frame rate to 40 frames per second as always, and I gotta tell you, it was surprisingly stable at 40 frames per second with almost no frame loss at all, even in the most intense moments with a lot of opponent cars in my view. But how was the feeling then? Well, once again, it suddenly runs butter smooth. I know I'm using the word butter smooth a lot, but it is really smooth. Driving the Ferrari in Assetto Corsa Competizione with smart smoothing enabled became so much more realistic, and it simply felt like full 80 frames per second frame rate on my Pimax 8K with 80 Hz. Yes, I could indeed see some minor ghosting occasionally at the opponent cars, but most of the time I didn't even notice any artifacts or problems. And yes, smart smoothing finally makes this simulator fully playable with high resolution and wide field of view on the Pimax VR headsets in VR. Now, I know many of you have been waiting for this one. Digital Combat Simulator or DCS World 2.5, and here it comes. As the performance is slightly better running this simulator in native mode through the Pytool software without SteamVR running, I decided to run it this way, and I was not able to record any output from the FPS VR framerate application. Instead, I used another application for the framerate reporting, and just like FPS VR, it only reports the rendered framerate of 40 frames per second and not the reprojected an interpolated frame rate, which is shown in the VR headset while having smart smoothing enabled. Also, in this case I had to record the desktop view instead of the mirror view, which explains the slightly worse aliasing in this capture that was not really seen in VR as I used very high resolution. If you want to maintain rather high quality settings in Digital Combat Simulator, including an in-game super sampling at 1.4 or higher to make the cockpit look very sharp and readable, it's fairly difficult to reach frame rates higher than around 50 or maybe 60 frames per second on a Pimax headset with a 150 degrees of normal field of view. And many times you will get even lower frame rates of around 40 frames per second, especially in the Persian Gulf map. Now, having the smart smoothing enabled instead, I have the frame rate fully stable at 40 frames per second, and to my big surprise it really made this simulator silky smooth. Once again, yes, silky smooth. This must be the first time I'm flying this FA-18 Hornet with a Pimax where I really feel the crazy acceleration and speed. I didn't feel that before, to be honest, and the smooth movements of simply everything, also including the wide field of view and high resolutions, made the Digital Combat Simulator look and feel more realistic than ever. Now again, there are some downsides. There are moments which are occasional, but sometimes it just happens, especially when you roll the aircraft, that your surroundings get a ghosting effect or some kind of reprojected double image of the scenery, and this is visible until it stabilizes again and gets fully smooth after a few seconds. Most of the time within a second or less, but sometimes it can take up to a few seconds until it's fully stabilized. It's like the smart smoothing cannot always stabilize and render correctly during the fast vertical panning of the scenery. Same thing with opponent aircraft that many times has ghosting effect when flying very close to you. This is probably something that Pimax needs to keep working on and keep improving with smart smoothing, but apart from that I cannot see any other issues as long as the frame rate is stable and does not go below 40 frames per second, in my case using the Pimax 8K. Now let's try Race Room Racing Experience, a partially free-to-play racing simulator. This simulator runs at stable and max frame rate most of the time with my RTX 2080 Ti, but using the maximum in-game graphical settings and also setting the in-game super sampling with a command line upon startup to the highest possible value of 4.0, things start to run slower, I must say. With these settings I had a frame rate of around 45 frames per second on my RTX 2080 Ti, or 50 at most, which made the experience quite juddery and stuttery on the 8K. Turning the smart smoothing on, things got of course super smooth once again. It's like playing Race Room at full frame rate suddenly, and I can tell you I could not notice any visible artifacts except for a few moments when the opponent cars got some minor ghosting when they drove past me at high speeds. This experience now both looks amazingly sharp and detailed, but also it's very smooth, and I could not notice any frame drops below these 40 frames per second at any time, and so no stutters or judders at all. This means theoretically that you can most likely play this racing simulator fully smooth even on low-end GPUs, as long as you keep the in-game settings and super sampling at reasonable levels. Next flight simulator to try is the IL-2 Sturmovik, which in most cases runs pretty smooth without smart smoothing on my RTX 2080 Ti, but for this session I maxed out the in-game settings and also disabled the overclocking on my GPU to see how it performs, and yes, I got some occasional dips to even below 70 frames per second, which made it a less smooth experience of course. Having the smart smoothing enabled, the frame rate was only interpolating or reprojecting at 40 frames per second when needed, and when the frame rate was full 80 frames per second, it automatically disabled smart smoothing. The transition between auto-enabling and auto-disabling smart smoothing was not perfect in IL-2 Sturmovik, as it apparently kicks in a bit too late, introducing some minor judders until the frame rate locks at 40 frames per second. But once the frame rate is locked, this simulator becomes very smooth and immersive, giving you the proper sense of speed without the lag and judder. But once again there are some issues, and this time these might be deal-breaking problems. The aircraft propeller introduces many artifacts on basically everything that is in front or behind the propeller. The aiming scope looks sometimes deformed, creating weird shapes, and any aircrafts seen through the propeller looks very weird, making it difficult to aim at them. Hopefully the propeller, which is the main problem here, can be modded out and made invisible, but I'm not sure if that's actually possible. Also, the opponent aircrafts many times gets ghosting problem if they fly by you in fast speeds, which of course happens very often in this simulator doing air-to-air combat. Some ghosting can also be seen on ground objects when flying at low altitudes. So if you ask me if IL-2 Stormavik is fully playable with smart smoothing on, well, yes and no. If you fly airplanes without a rotating propeller in front of you, you will most likely be able to play this simulator and accept the other flaws. And indeed, this simulator itself runs very smooth at 40 frames per second thanks to this feature. But still, I find this ghosting on enemy aircrafts being quite frustrating issue, and I can't see myself really enjoying IL-2 Stormavik with smart smoothing enabled until it gets further improved by Pimax, hopefully in the next few updates. Okay, we have two more simulators to try, and the next one is my old favorite, Dirt Rally. For this test I ran the SteamVR version with the help of Revive Hack, as I had problems getting it to work without SteamVR directly through Python Launcher or the Oculus Home. Anyhow, boosting the graphic with the majority of settings on high and some on medium, including MSAA anti-aliasing at value 4, this rally simulator made my RTX 2080 Ti struggle a bit. I had frame rates between 50 and 60 frames per second the majority of time, which isn't optimal for a fast racing simulator like this. When I turned on smart smoothing though, it felt like night and day again. The race was super smooth with no lag whatsoever, no judders and no stutters, and the frame rate never really went below 40 frames per second. I could see some slight ghosting on objects inside of the car, such as the left and right mirrors, but it was never distracting. At the same time, Dirt Rally looked really beautiful with perfect clarity and a very smooth overall racing experience, which is for sure great news for people with less powerful graphic cards for VR, such as the GTX 1070 or the 1080 or equivalent. Lastly, I tried iRacing. This is, in my opinion, the most optimized VR racing simulator both in terms of sharpness and clarity, but also performance in VR. Using maximum in-game graphical settings on every single option made iRacing stunning looking and super sharp on the Pimax 8K. But still, I could not by any means get the smart smoothing to kick in with my RTX 2080 Ti. It was just butter smooth 80 frames per second all the time. Eventually I realized I could downclock my GPU with around 300 MHz using the EVGA Precision X1 software to simply cut off some performance from my graphic card, and finally I ended up with low frame rates enough, around 60 to 70 frames per second, which automatically enabled smart smoothing. And how did it look and feel in 40 frames per second then? Well, simply as good as running iRacing with a full frame rate of 80 frames per second, I would say. All surroundings outside of the car was just totally smooth with no visible ghosting or any other issues. So no surprises here either. The Pimax Brainwarp feature called Smart Smoothing really does the trick in basically all 10 simulators I've tested, and in 9 out of 10 cases it runs these simulators without any bigger issues or flaws. If you ask me, this is quite amazing results overall. Have in mind the low performance we have been dealing with for the past 6 months running simulators on the Pimax headset with wider field of views and high resolution. Now using smart smoothing instead, it just makes these simulators fully enjoyable again without frustration. The smooth movement is there, the sense of speed is there, and it just feels and works as it should, even if it's far from perfect as of today, especially in simulators like IL-2 Stormavik. I must say I'm very impressed that Pimax has got this feature working so fast with only 6 months after the first headset was shipped out, and I hope they will keep improving these Brainwarp techniques, because this, together with fixed foveated rendering, could be the game changer with wide field of view headsets once we move up to native 4K panels. Lastly, I should add that running smart smoothing is also possible with lower refresh rate modes available on the Pimax headsets, the 72Hz mode and the 64Hz mode. In theory, this could lower the GPU and CPU requirements even more, as the simulators would only need to render 36 or 32 frames per second, while still being fully smooth in VR, well, theoretically at least, but I will leave that analysis for another video coming up. I will soon follow up this video by doing same kind of tests in other VR games such as first-person shooters and maybe also other VR simulators using smart smoothing feature, so stay tuned and subscribe to my channel if you still haven't. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, a big thanks to every one of my Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador, my 3 official sponsors on Patreon. Cheers!